hard rubber, soft rubber. Hello friends, it's the Otter. Today we're doing a tune-up on the build for the Toyota 4Runner. So this is a 1997 Toyota 4Runner with a 3RZ FE engine, 2.7 liter, made from 95.5 to about 2002. So the valve cover is leaking and there is oil in the spark plug tube. So it's gonna be repair parts as needed. Basically tearing apart an old car, you're always gonna have to add parts in. Leaking valve cover gasket. And the main reason to do this is not only the oil leak, but we have quite a bit of oil on this spark plug. So essentially this could make misfires, and this thing is misfiring. Anytime you work on an old car like this, there's a good chance of you causing more damage than good, basically breaking vacuum, coolant lines, etc. So what I want you to do is basically go run the car, pay close attention to how it runs and how it idles. So I guess we'll start on this side. There's no right and wrong. So whenever you have these old cars and these old connectors, take your time and wiggle them off. Okay, so we're gonna get a tiny little bladed screwdriver and we're gonna pick the bottom of the connector up. Okay, it's not fully broken, that's good. So basically, I'm gonna need a lot of room in there to check the valve adjustments with the feeler gauge. So I'm gonna remove this power steering cruise control mechanism. Okay, there's 3 bolts on this guy. So I'm assuming a lot of shit on this car has never been taken off since 1997. So some of these connectors are incredibly stuck. So the cruise control connector, instead of prying up, like I did on the mass airflow sensor, we actually had to pry that one down. As we see, it moves down when I push the button. So you just have to understand what you're doing and take your time. So I call this the tsunami technique. We basically start here and we move like a wave. So the goal here is to remove this all in one piece because these things really like to break. If you end up having to replace these, do not be surprised. So this rubber piece has been replaced. It's got a Dorman sticker on it. That's kind of a good thing because that one won't break. Two breather hoses here, and these are definitely original. These two right here are definitely original 1997 hoses, and I can tell because they're basically super hard like a stone. So that one's got some serious cracking, and it's probably gonna leak vacuum after I took that off. Dry, dry, dry. Soaked. Now we can start. Oof, that's probably why it was leaking. These weren't even, valve cover bolts weren't even tight. Okay, the whole valve cover is unbolted and there's one hidden screw, so we do have to remove the wiring harness that goes on the back of the engine. There's 2 clips. Two clips you can get with your fingernail. So when you're dealing with this ancient wiring harness, you need to not put too much tension on it, on the back of the valve cover, and they look identical to this clip, and you basically just take your fingernail and pull it up and pull it out. So it's pretty impressive. This thing has 300,000 miles and we have almost no wear on the camshafts. Timing chain is tight. Okay, so this is not the fun part. We have to dig out the spark plug tube holes. I'm gonna start with this one because it was the first one in my toolbox. Oh, it came out easy. So this thing is hard as a stone. Okay, it looks like someone put silicone in here. It's a pretty common rookie mistake for someone to do. Okay, this is a very commonly forgot portion service of the valve cover gasket. So I'll put a new valve cover gasket on and it's gonna leak out of these half moons. So you just basically, see how loose they were? That silicone was definitely gonna be rotted. Okay, so I don't have the ideal cleaning station, so we're just kind of winging it. Try to knock off some of this nastiness. So we do have a new PCV grommet here. I doubt that's going to come out without a fight. So there is a rubber grommet holding the PCV valve inside of the valve cover. So I spent close to an hour trying to get that out and ended up snapping the PCV valve off. Once I snapped it off, I was able to chisel the rock hard rubber out of the valve cover and fully remove it. Now, all those little rock chips fell inside the valve cover, so make sure you shake it around if you do experience such a problem. All of this stuff is to be expected from a 1997 car. Okay, this is the hardest PCV valve I have ever removed. And I'm still not done. Now it's time to thoroughly clean that valve cover off, and this is the unexciting, super tedious part of doing any oil leak. It basically doubles the amount of time from actually installing and removing the part. Now you may not be supposed to do this, but when I'm putting the spark plug tube seals or any rubber O-ring into plastic, I put a thick coating of Sil Glide on every surface to make sure it goes in easy. Once you do this, you can basically push in the spark plug tube seal by hand most of the way. Once it's basically in place, you can hammer it down a little bit more flush and then get yourself a socket that fits on the outer diameter. Make sure it's the outer diameter to not damage the seal. This was a pretty easy one, and some of the Toyota ones are pretty difficult. The valve cover bolts themselves have little rubber O-rings that basically need to be replaced because they are going to be rock hard and you are not going to get the correct torque spec. So while the engine was basically taken apart at this point, I did clean the top of the cylinder head very thoroughly with the alcohol that I had laying around. So I decided to pull the spark plugs out to do a quick inspection, because remember at the front of the video I said this is replace as necessary. We got some really bad news on these spark plugs. So there's a very concerning thing. One of the spark plugs electrodes is bent. We have such a bent electrode, I'm going to get a new PCV valve and a new spark plug set. I know the wires are new, so we're going to leave that alone. But I'm a little bit concerned that the piston did contact the spark plug because it's so bent. Cleaning done, had lunch, picked up the incidental parts. We got spark plugs, PCV valve, and an air filter, basically a tune-up job on this truck. But I'm gonna jump into that valve clearances now because that could be one of the reasons this truck lacks power. Basically the valves are too much gap or too tight. So this website is called Charm, and it's like free car repair manuals, and this thing's a 1997. So the information is pretty easy to get. Now I'm not a full-time mechanic anymore, so the free stuff is gonna work. So we're gonna check the valve clearances on our 3RZ FE. So we have intake camshaft, we have 10 thousandths. Okay, so the intake manifold is on this side, so that would be the intake side. We have one intake lobes sticking straight up, and it looks like I'll be able to get a feeler gauge in there. Okay, we are checking the first one. So basically in the upright position, 0.0 is the maximum it should be. So 0.10 would be big, probably 10 because it's got some drag. Side, or the intake side, because the exhaust side is the one that gets all the heat. So this one is 0.6 to 0.10. So all these valves are kind of on the tight side. Some very bad news on the valves. All of them are borderline tight or too tight. Now the exhaust valves being too tight is actually pretty dangerous because it could burn the head or whatever. The problem is that job is a massive job of math calculations, ordering the dealership, pulling the things out, keeping track of it. I've done it before, it's pretty challenging. I wouldn't recommend that unless you're pretty experienced. So what I'm gonna do is basically bolt this truck back together. If it does start ticking, I will do the valve adjustment later, but for now we're just gonna nurse this thing like the lawnmower it is. Okay, so this is the certified torque wrench, and they're usually about 12, 15 Newton meters or foot-pounds of torque. So if you don't know what you're doing, use a torque wrench. If you've done this before, you know. You just basically turn it until it goes beep, 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 beep. So here's some very bad news on cylinder 4 on the back. Basically, that one was super tight super loose when I pulled it out. And now it's not tightening. Apply a good layer of Vaseline or Sil-Glide into those spark plug tubes. So don't forget to put 4 dabs of silicone on your half moons. 4 dabs, that's it. So now we're gonna fit the valve cover onto the cylinder head. So this is a super important step. We need to pay close attention to the spark plug tube seals and make sure they are fully seated in the valve cover. You can use a little plastic pick to make sure they're in place. When tightening the valve cover, start from the center and work your way out. I use a 1/4 inch ratchet to go through with a final torque setting. You don't want these too tight. So remember, the passenger side rear is the only difficult bolt to install on this valve cover, and we did have to remove the wiring harness to access the one bolt. So as you can see, basically you just want to go around in circles and make sure everything is pretty snugly tight. So I forgot to put the PCV valve back in, so make sure you put some Sil-Glide and push it back in. Okay, we're hooking the harness back up. So my particular 4Runner had a missing ground wire that was just hanging down, so I bolted it into the valve cover. The charge pipe, the intake pipe, has 2 hoses connected, one large one that's like a PCV vent, and then there's a fuel pressure regulator vacuum one on the front of the intake air pipe. So I do have some cracked hoses, and you could put some silicone on these, but I'm just gonna see if this thing will run. Anytime you work on an old car like this, there's a good chance of you causing more damage than good. Basically, this is a long series of videos restoring this classic 1997 3rd generation 4Runner. So if you want to see the entire build, click this playlist on your screen.